Okay, I want to talk about chords a little bit. Let's quickly review what a chord is. A chord is really just when you're playing more than one note at the same time. So, for instance, there's a chord. There's a different chord. So there's many different kinds of chords. You can stack the notes in literally infinite ways, and they all create different feelings. And coming to be familiar with these feelings is quite important. But for now, our focus is just on the function of chords themselves. So first of all, what instruments can play chords? Well, the piano and other instruments that have keyboards can play chords because they can play multiple notes at once. As you can see, I can hold down multiple notes at the same time. Guitars can do that as well, and other instruments with strings, like a harp, and even violins and violas can play a little bit, like they can play two notes at one time. But for full chords, you kind of need to be able to really get your fingers across a lot of notes. And mostly that job comes from instruments that have keyboards, like synthesizers, pianos, and electric pianos, and everything else that has a keyboard. And then also guitars really is the other big one. Now, instruments that can't play chords would be monophonic instruments. Remember, mono means single and poly means multiple. Polyphonic versus monophonic. Monophonic instruments might be like a saxophone or a flute, the human voice. In fact, a large majority of the instruments in the world can't play chords. But those instruments can play in sections. That means multiple instruments can play at once, and each of them play a different note, and then they can play a chord together. So you might have 3 trumpets, each one playing a different note, and then those 3 notes form together to make a chord. So monophonic instruments end up playing chords when they play in sections, but they themselves can't play chords. Now, the purpose of chords really is to create emotion in the song. As you can tell, if I play a certain chord, that feels a certain way. Now if I play this one, that feels different. How about this one? Different still. Maybe this one. Weird. Very strange. So you see, different chords have different feelings. So being discerning and careful about choosing our chords is important because our chords are going to color the way our song sounds. So I often spend a long time when I'm choosing a chord progression. Now we're not going to get into writing chords right now, but soon in the future we are going to get into writing chords, and I feel it's important to take time to get to know what different chords sound like so you can really be sure of your choice of which chord you want to use because it has such a dramatic effect on the feeling of a song. The other purpose of chords is to create tension and release or forward movement in the song. So certain chords feel rested and certain other chords feel tense. Like I can play an example maybe. Here's a rested chord. And here's a chord with some tension. Feels a little bit weird, right? Unstable. Like it wants to just relax. And this one relaxes it. So this sense of certain chords being tense and resolving to other chords or creating that release or relaxation is also an important part of chords. It's a little more complicated than just knowing what chords are and how to use them. It's more of an advanced way to look at chords that we'll also cover briefly in the future. And lastly, chords fill out a large portion of the frequency spectrum. Like when we're making a song, if we just had a melody and a bass line and drums, we'd be missing a huge chunk of the notes available to us and the song might sound empty. So let's take a listen to that. I'm going to mute the chords right now. Doesn't sound terrible, but something's kind of missing, so let's bring them in. So it just thickens everything up. Also provides some emotion that's not there when the chords aren't there. Let's hear the chords in isolation. Now you might notice I have two tracks playing here. One is a piano and the other is a synth, and I have them layered together playing exactly the same part. So if I just ungroup these, we're going to be able to listen to just the piano and just the synth. So you see I have the synth much quieter, but together they create a nice texture. So this is an example of having multiple instruments play the same part. And the part wouldn't be quite as filled out if I didn't have both of these instruments. So I've chosen that very purposefully to have two instruments playing the same chords exactly. But sometimes you might have two instruments playing very slightly different variations of the chords. Same chords, but different voicings, it's called, different variations of the same chord to kind of fill out the part in a different way. In this case, I went for straight doubling. This part is playing the exact same thing as this part. So like with the other instruments, I want to quickly talk about hearing chords, hearing chord changes, and starting to become aware of that when you're listening to music. So when you're hearing music in the world, beyond hearing the drums, beyond hearing just the bass, we want to be able to hear the chord changes. Now, at first, we're not going to be able to actually hear what the chords are, because chords are very complex, but we can hear when the chords change. That's what I want to point out. So chords change, and the feeling, the emotion will change, sometimes in a subtle way, sometimes in a dramatic way. Let's listen to the beat again, and I'm going to mute the melody. I'll leave everything else in, and let's check out these chords. If I look at it down here, so you can see, here's a chord, here's a chord, here's a chord. These are all different chords playing for the most part. Let's listen. Change, 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 change. So sometimes a chord gets hit more than once, the same chord. Like for instance, this chord and this chord are exactly the same. It's just a rhythm, basically. It's just having the same chord hit twice to create a more interesting rhythm before it changes. But here, these three chords are different. One chord, second chord, third chord. So becoming aware of this concept that chords kind of underpin or make a foundation for a lot of modern music, if not all, you can start to listen for them. And all sorts of different instruments can be playing chords, but we're not so much interested in like the specifics of what chord's being played and how is it playing it. It's more just the feeling of the chords and coming to comprehend when chords change. Just understanding that that's a thing. That's how music works, is that there's chords, chords change. The bass line follows the chord changes for the most part. And then the melody, which we're going to talk about in the next video, sits on top of this whole structure where you've got the drums with the bass and the chords, and then the melody is kind of soaring on top of all of that as the focal point that everything else is enhancing. So good to become aware of chords in general and start listening for them. Try to peel your mind away from listening to the melody and just focus on the chords. When the chords change, the big groups of notes change underneath the melody. So that's all for now for chords. In the next video, we're going to talk about melody.